Glad you all are here tonight for this conversation in a lively church with a lot of sound, so I'll try to speak up so y'all can hear me. So we'll gather till about 7 o'clock, and our topic for tonight is Article 2 of the UUA, which is our bylaws, which describe our principles and purposes. So if you see right on that wall back there, I can do this for you all too. Back on that wall, we have our 7 principles and purposes of how we promise to be together in Unitarian Universalism, in our congregations, and in our communities. And these are our guiding principles that you're probably familiar with, the 7 principles, and then the 6 sources as well, which you're probably a little less familiar with, but you may know those as well. So we'll go through a little bit of where we are in this process, a little history about our principles and when they started and how many versions there have been, and then to what the process is now as well. There are some handouts here for the Article 2 study report if you want a paper one, and that's also available online. So in terms of resources for folks online as well, I'm just going to do this. If you Google UUA Article 2, it'll bring you to a resource page where you can see what their process has been. You can see this full report, and then they link some articles as well to some of the histories that I'll be talking about, referencing just shortly. So this is your 101 to UU principles, where we've been and where we are, to give an overview. And then, like anything in this church, like spirituality and justice work, and it's up to you to continue your own exploration and keep learning and engaging in other ways. We'll have some other forums later this spring as well to discuss where things have gone. But I want to start with this. Whoops, I have to share it. Pardon me as I remember how to do multi-platform here with Zoom. I'm going to do it this way so folks online can see it too. Okay. So, here we are. You can see that? You all can see that. So first, a brief timeline. Our first principles were adopted in 1961, which was at the time of merger. If you're not familiar with that, that's when Unitarian Universalism became its own association, the joining of the Unitarian Church in America and Universalist Church in America, 1961. So we're, in terms of a joint movement, we're a pretty young religious movement in the United States, but both of those traditions, of course, go back much further. So the 6 principles were first adopted. There were 6 then, not 7. And the language was what you might imagine from 1961. A lot of man, brotherhood, God, of fairly narrow gendered language and fairly narrow theological language as well. And I appreciated this. This is from one of the articles about the principles. It said, the original statement of the purposes of the UUA, adopted in 1960, as these churches were consolidating, no longer served the need. The statement's precise wording had been matter of such heated debate that it nearly derailed the merger at the concurrent but separate preparatory sessions of the 2 denominations the year before. The contention revolved around whether to include such phrases as, quote, love to God and love to man, and a reference to, quote, our Judeo-Christian heritage. A compromise version, including a critical change from our heritage to the heritage, was finally hammered out in an all-day, all-night parliamentary negotiation and debate. So we were forged in controversy and challenge and vigorous, strong opinions that really did create complexity at the merging of these denominations, and created, we need some statement that says who we are, that brings us together in some sense of shared purpose and identity. But how are we going to combine these unique traditions that have a lot of similarities, obviously, if we're talking about merger. But this became a point of contention, but they finally did adopt those 6 principles. You can easily find those online. I didn't want to go through, I just wanted to give a little overview. One thing I'll say too about some of the opposition to having principles at all in that merger time, and that concern has continued since over time, is a phrase called creeping creedalism. Right? So you can imagine, it's descriptive, right? The fear that the principles are a veiled creed. We say we're a tradition of covenant, how we promise to be in relationship, of spiritual freedom, and we are not a tradition of creeds or doctrinal beliefs and unified statements, right? And so the argument was, the principles are just a creed. We just call them principles instead, right? And so it was the fear that that was becoming the creed of Unitarian Universalism, that it would become dogmatic and doctrinal. And so there was a commitment from the early on that it would constantly be revisited for revisions, reformations, additional ideas, tweaks, changes over time that adapt to the changing world and the changing nature of Unitarian Universalism. So from its beginnings, it was contentious. There was a lot of feelings about it. There was an invitation to not make it static, because ours is a living tradition. That's the hallmark of these traditions, is that we are constantly evolving, changing, and open to a changing world. So creeping creedalism. The one thing UUs are afraid of, creeds. Could have a little like pseudo horror film on that or something. So the 6 principles in 1961. First major revision of the principles, which were really driven by women leaders in the Unitarian Universalist Association, ministers and lay, happened in 1985. And that's where our 7 principles and 6 sources were kind of originated in mostly what we have known as our principles and sources since. They took out language that was so specific around God. They took out and shifted language around gender to make it not just brotherhood and man. So changing with the times. 1985 is not particularly cutting edge for gender inclusive language, but it was a move which was good in the right direction. Jumping ahead, there's been conversation around the principles for years, but jumping ahead to the most recent and what this study commission report comes from is in 2020 and a little before. There's an introduction among some leaders in the association to introduce an 8th principle, which focused on anti-oppression, anti-racism, justice and equity in a little different lens. And that has been, if you're a UU-like nerd, if you follow along the association, you know that 8th principle has been adopted by individual congregations, many throughout the country. Since we're a congregational tradition, the idea that local congregations have agency and power to make their own decisions, it was encouraged that folks could add the 8th principle on their own without the General Assembly having officially, formally adopted it at all. And part of that conversation at the same time opened up to a general, like, we haven't revisited our principles for a while. We ought to do that. That's a simplistic way of saying these conversations were happening in many different formats and modes. And so the introduction of the 8th principle, focusing on anti-racism and anti-oppression, was happening at the same time that reviewing Article 2 of our association's bylaws and our principles came about as well. So the study commission was charged by the board of the UUA to take a deep look at how do our principles and sources serve us and our purposes? How might they need to be changed or revised or shifted over time? And then bring that to the board, and that will bring to the General Assembly. So there's been opportunities. I don't know if any of you were here. The Reverend Meg Riley preached here this summer and preached about Article 2 and some of this work. There's been opportunities through the UUA itself for national conversations that folks wanted to join in on that. But if you're like me, there's been a lot happening these last couple of years, both in our congregation locally and in the world. So there's a lot to track. So we're trying to get us up to speed a little bit on what's happened so far and what's coming next. So the commission's proposal comes to General Assembly, which is in Pittsburgh this summer in June. And then there's a mini assembly at General Assembly where amendments can come either from the board of the UUA or the assembly itself can make amendments to it. And then a final version will be presented next year at General Assembly 2024, which is likely going to be an all virtual General Assembly. They tend to get more, they've noticed that during the pandemic. If they do focus a lot of energy into online and virtual engagement, they get a lot wider participation. And so the idea is kind of going back and forth every other year, all virtual, multi-platform, all virtual, multi-platform. So 2024 will likely be all virtual is the earliest that the final version would be voted on at GA. It would need a 2/3 vote to become adopted by the assembly after needing a simple majority this coming year. So in the following year, it would need a 2/3 vote to be adopted, and then it would replace our principles and sources as we know them to this new set that we'll talk about. So I'll pause there. Questions, looking online too. Any questions on kind of where we are, some of that history? That's a broad, quick swath since merger in 61, about the time this building was built.
You know, this, I just I still kind of try to figure out how these two came together with one Christian universal salvation and the other, very humanistic. Was it that they were kind of, maybe we said it was faltering, and yet they were both very forward thinking and such, and so they decided, I think we could compromise and figure this out, come together. Was that basically it?
That's a good summary. Yeah, I'd say the short version is both traditions had a long history of being unorthodox in their beliefs. So they went against traditional, conventional, conservative Christian doctrine. So they were willing to be open to learning and shifting their doctrinal, theological, spiritual beliefs. And they had some shared social values around the social gospel and a sense of like the religious spiritual life is about doing justice in the world, making this world more beautiful and treating all people as sacred, focusing more on that than the sinful part of humanity. The Unitarians were probably fine institutionally. The Universalists, I think, benefited more in terms of institutional strength by joining with the Unitarians. But yes, a shared like openness moving out of orthodoxy throughout their histories. And then they're like, we should be best friends. Yeah.
I think it's worth mentioning that Unitarians really weren't humanists. They believed in a single God. They just didn't believe in the Trinity.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So they weren't accepted as a Christian church.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's two churches that have a belief in God. They just have a slightly different understanding.
Yeah, thank you that's a good reminder.
So it makes it easier for them to come together.
Yeah, humanism really came out more shortly after 1900.
Okay.
More so. So, I mean, by the time of merger, there was a lot of humanism in both traditions. But back in the day, William Ellery Channing at Arlington Street Church in Boston, which kind of helped define Unitarianism in America in the mid-1800s, had a famous sermon called Unitarian Christianity. Talking about like, we are almost culturally Christian, like we worship on Sunday. I mean, we still kind of are here, right? We worship on Sundays. The form looks like a Christian church. The content is a little different. In terms of when and how we practice and gather together. So yeah.
Actually, I went, from the UK, and the UK still has Unitarian churches,
right?
And they haven't made that sort of change. So I went to a Unitarian service. And I thought, this is so different,
Right.
I could see there were sort of shared values, but it was still probably just as Unitarians were here 50 years ago.
Yes, 40s and 50s,
Yeah, they still see themselves as being Christians.
Right. Yeah. Till biblical readings every Sunday, communion often on Sundays. That their interpretation is Jesus is our core ethical person. We just believe God was better than him. Like they weren't equal, right? So we rejected the notion of the Trinity. But Channing said that the Bible doesn't necessarily make you have to conclude that the Trinity is the only way to understand God or Jesus. So we can still be biblical Christians, but not believe that Jesus was equal with God.
Thank you for.
That's a whole nother
revealing-
forum.
I mean, I knew a
I
lot
love
of that a long time ago, but
Yeah.
it's been decades since I've revisited, so
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes. Lana and then Darren.
Is it true that GA is no charge this year for admission?
I can neither confirm nor deny at the moment. I'm not
I was
sure.
on the website today, and oh yeah, there's a cost.
Because I have an email saying it was free.
Maybe that's last year.
No,
I'll look into that to confirm. I think they were trying to defray costs and provide a lot more opportunities for free opportunities, like free engagement and registration, but I don't think it was a universal thing.
okay.
I definitely
my-
had registration fees out there today.
Okay,
That
yeah,
was kind of hefty. It looked like $100.
yeah,
It's like $400.
yeah.
Oh, that's,
For in person, for in person.
okay.
All right, Darren.
I know when you talked about the creeping creedalism,
Yeah.
could you just say, what is the difference between a principle and a creed?
Right. Yeah, it's a.
Can you repeat the
That's it.
question?
Yeah, yeah. Darren asked, "What is the difference between a principle and a creed?" Right. Oh, there's so many angles that I could take. I would say in general, some of it is kind of semantics, but a lot of it is what is the approach of how you attend to those words, right? How are you connecting as a movement or as an individual to the words expressed? So in the introduction to our principles, it says we covenant, promise, to affirm and promote these principles or values, right? It isn't saying, I believe this, right? And then have more doctrinal tenets. I think, so the critique of creeds would say creeds just define very narrowly what you need to believe, and your theological affirmation to that makes you part of a community. And a covenantal-based community would say, our promise is to be in community together, regardless of spiritual or doctrinal belief. However, no matter what your spirituality is, it needs to ascribe to these general principles and values. So it's almost like a filter through which, rather than like, yes, these are my theological beliefs. And that's why we encourage folks to do like when they do the This I Believe service and say, these are things I believe. In our tradition, you're called to make your own personal creed, but don't assume that it applies universally, if that kind of makes sense. And I'll balance that to say, liberal Christians, even when I was in liberal Lutheran school, the creed was seen as one poetic source of the Christian heritage. That's how it was described. That is one interpretation in our history that points us to some sense of wisdom and truth and the nature of God and humanity. It is not meant to be literal the same way biblical scripture is, right?
It's a principle.
Yeah, kind of. So, and of course, not every Christian approaches the creeds in that way, but that does exist among liberal Christianity today too. So there's less of an obvious, clear dichotomy between these things. I'd say they overlap a little bit, but historically are different. Yeah. Okay. We're covering a lot of fun ground. All right. Next slide is, so this is how the commission expressed What is the purpose of having principles? What is the point of it? If we don't want people to have to ascribe to a set of beliefs and make it a litmus test for belonging, what is the point? So they said these are the purposes for them. They're theological, helping us articulate our shared values. They're social, they serve as a shared cultural touchstone. They're educational, it lists concepts to teach and sources to draw from. They're personal, serves as a personal code of ethics. They're evangelical, which is pretty great, like way to go, Commission 2, pushing the envelope on some of the language we're comfortable with. I love that. Evangelical, a way to explain to others who we are and draw their interest. And rhetorical, used in public situations to define our beliefs or morality in legal or political contexts. One thing I'll say about evangelical, and this was in some of the articles about the principles as well, of why they chose that language, is the word translates to good news. So what good news are you sharing, you know? And in that way, and sharing it, like being open to share with others what speaks to you, what is the good word, right? That nourishes you. So in that way, it's pushing you to say, you have a message that's worth sharing with the world, and you should be a little more evangelical and not let conventional conservative Christianity own that word, because it has a much longer, richer religious history than thinking like evangelical defines a whole way of being in the world. It doesn't. It describes something. It's particular in American Christianity, and complicated. But anyway, it's just a little side note. So those are the reasons behind them, of how they approached them. Here is the initial graphic representation of moving from 7 principles to, there's a little semantics, 6 core values that is centered on love. So the drawing off in particular, I kind of love the switch too, towards the universalist heritage, which has often been overshadowed throughout since our merger, because to be honest, the Unitarians had the education and the money. They also had political clout, right? And the Universalists were the blue-collar farmers having their tent revivals that just loved an all-loving God, right? Love has always been the center of Universalist theology. And in this representation, it says love is the center and the core of what we do. It guides all, like that is the spiritual value at the center of who we are as Unitarian Universalists. And it connects with our Side with Love campaign for justice work in the world, the bright yellow shirts, and how that shows up in the public square. And then out of that, from that place, come these core values, which is interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice. So one of the initial concerns shared in some of these forums were, it's nice but simplistic. There's so little there, and these are common words in corporate settings and like in a lot of places, and like what makes it particularly part of our theological tradition. And so then they expand and use some of the language from our current 7 principles into these areas, these values. So first, interdependence, honoring the interdependent web of all existence, covenanting to cherish the earth and all beings by creating and nourishing relationships. Pluralism, I'll just go through these quickly knowing you can return to them. Celebrating that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. Covenanting to learn from one another in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So you'll recognize some of this language. Justice, work to be a diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. Covenant to dismantle racism and systemic oppression. Transformation, adapt to a changing world. We talked about that at the beginning. To collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Generosity, cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. Covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Then equity, declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. Covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain that. So much of the, not all, some fair amount of the language from the current 7 principles are in the descriptions of these values. And that was intentional too. Earlier versions, as they were drafting it over the last couple of years, didn't have as much of that. And that was a concern. So they wanted to bring some of that with in more intentional ways. So I'm just going to go back to give you that image again. Love at the center of all we do. Values of interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice. Then the next part, I want to open it up. Inspirations. This is in place of the 6 sources that specifically list theological sources. This is one area that ministers are grappling with. Because there's something about the specificity of naming specific traditions from which we come that felt like a more honest naming of our lineage. And so there's some conversation of how might the inspiration section be more full and filled out than its current version. So inspirations, as Unitarian Universalists, we use and are inspired by sacred and secular understandings that help us to live into our values. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which they were created and are currently practiced. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. Grateful for the religious ancestries we inherit and the diversity which enriches our faith, we're called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom. And I will say, so ministers are like, but we used to name humanism, the Judeo-Christian tradition we come from, like all these things. And when someone sees our principles and sources online and then comes to our church and notices how seldom we actually have a biblical reading as part of Sunday morning worship, they might think, no, this actually more accurately describes what you do, right? It's more broad, it's more modern poetry and modern readings, even though that's our taproot. So this is a little more spiritually expansive. So that's still, all of this is a very lively conversation and there's different vantage points. So I want to pause there. Yeah, and then it was some logistics for moving forward, I'll share, but pause there for thoughts, reactions, wrestlings, appreciations, like, I like this, or I'm not sure about this, or I don't know what I think.
So what we're looking at is, this would probably be it? I mean, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fine.
So that, those values with love at the center, and then those values with those longer descriptions would be what's in Article 2 of our bylaws, where currently the principles and sources are.
Okay.
So it would replace that section.
All right, that's what I thought.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is more than just adding principle 8, am I correct?
Yes.
This is a
Yeah,
whole.
that's what I thought too.
Yeah.
Never advanced.
Yep. So Principle 8 and revising Article 2 were kind of parallel conversations. Principle 8 kind of preceded it a little bit in terms of talking about anti-oppression work and having that more intentionally in our principles. And then it expanded further.
Okay.
So in theory, right, any congregation who's adopted the 8th principle and gone through a good process for that, the principles might not exist, you know, in the same format. So it's incorporated into these values differently. Yeah.
So if we looked at what you covered and then we compared it with the principles, is there anything to your mind that we'd say, well, this is being de-emphasized, or there's not so much on this, or there's more emphasis on something? You know, is there a sort of some pointers in terms of direction it's gone, or
That's a good
is it
question.
just a different way of looking at the same thing?
Yes and no. It depends on who you ask and what was maybe particularly meaningful about the current set of principles. There are some shifts in terms of I mean, a very small thing, there's a little less that's directed toward congregational life, specifically in the principles, in part because of the changing nature of church. You know, there are some brick and mortar churches like ours, many that are healthy and strong and kind of do church in the kind of way you typically think about church, like Sunday services and programs and that. And then there's an expanding field of entrepreneurial ministries and types of ministry in the community that are less based in a physical congregation, that are more about community building and justice work. So some of these values are meant to be a little more broad than focusing on like a particular congregational physical setting, if that kind of makes sense. So that could be a both and, like a little bit of a loss, but also a helpful shift, depending on how you look at it. Other thoughts or initial reactions or like confusions? Yeah.
Started, because we've been looking at this for a while, for a little while anyway.
Ian, could you talk up or have you?
Oh, actually, yeah, I can even take my mask off because you'll never understand with your mask. Yeah, in looking at it, one of the things I wonder, it's interesting to me that the principles are a single covenant. This feels like multiple covenants, and as a single covenant, there was a flow and an intermingling of the principles. I don't get that feeling in this. I'm struggling with, and I don't have a big problem with the idea of love as the center, but the section at the bottom of 19 where it talks about love is the power that holds us together, is at the center of our shared values. Smacks of creed. It's not
creed?
part of the covenant. It's just sitting
Sounds
there.
like creed. Got it.
Is the previous article in section 2.2, the principles, was basically, one covenant. This has a lot more wordiness to it. They talk about it being simple because of the single word values, but I look at those and say, there are a whole lot of religions out there that would say they could lay these right over the top. And love simply equates to God. So that it doesn't hit to me on the uniqueness.
Doesn't feel this, I'm kind of just repeating a little bit, doesn't feel distinctive.
No, it doesn't feel like it hits the
definitive for Unitarian
distinctive,
Universalism.
the distinctive aspects of being a Unitarian Universalist.
Yeah.
And you start to get it when you get down into the explanations. But even some of the explanations have a turn from the previous principles, and having been heavily involved in Principle 4, right? Where is it down here? It talks about we covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning, not support each other, which is very different, because many of us don't think of our learning and our free and responsible search as just existing among the people. We do a whole lot more. That's what the sources are for. That's what all the stuff we look at is for, right? There are places it feels like they've played around with the language in ways that support the views of the people who are doing this, and not necessarily support the views of the people who are down here, so to speak, at the bottom. I have problems too in the section on equity. The inherent worth and dignity is principle 1. It's not even part of the covenant. And what they're covenanting to, what we're covenanting to in this is not the same thing. That really bothers me, because to me that's principle 1. The the more I look at it, the more disturbed I get about the changes that they want to make, and I don't see the point in simplifying. I like the fact that there's the idea of diversity and things like that. That's inherent and that's beautiful. But feels like they've made things more complicated. I mean, that's what I do by nature, and I think I recognize it when I see it.
An attempt to simplify.
You know, we
and it
took
gets more
something that
complicated.
took this much space and we made it take 2 pages or 3 pages.
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
If I could chime in,
Yeah, Laura.
Please.
This is the first time I'm seeing and hearing all of this.
Yeah.
And this is obviously the first time I just heard your thoughts, Anne, and everyone else who's shared. And it occurs to me that part of our problem as a religion is that because we're rarefied and distinctive and unique, we're a bunch of middle-class white people. And so this more like palatable and accessible language and the way it's organized could solve some of that specialness that actually causes us to separate from the people we wish to draw near, or wish would come near. So if less, so I'm not seeing less distinctive, less rarefied, less unique as a problem.
More inclusive.
Yeah, I'm not thinking that it needs to be rarefied or unique. What I'm thinking is that it doesn't feel to me as though it talks about what makes Unitarian Universalism Unitarian Universalism. How do we distinguish it from being Methodist or Lutheran or whatever? Right? That's my concern, I guess, as much as anything.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
So the first thing I see when I see love is I do see the word God, but I see God in action. So when I see love, the word love brings action. I believe, first of all, I believe we're all God stuff. So if you want to define God, start by looking at your to the right, to the left. So when I see that, I see, wow, I come from unity where love is included in 12 principles or 12 powers. It's included, but it's always talked about as a center. So I'm like, when I saw it at the center, I was like, whoa, this is actually saying, okay, now we're going to say love. We're all inclusive. We're all in equity. We're looking at equity. We're looking. It's not just us white people sitting here. It's everybody else I didn't look around. Gus isn't here. So it's more. And we're about to move, right? We're a community that's about to move and grow, and it really opens up my pea brain because it's the first time I'm seeing it. I'm a student of UU. That's it just opens everything up. It feels like my heart just opened up. I have to share that because when I see that word love in there, doesn't matter what's around it. What love speaks to me is that we're a community that's going to bring more people. We're going to grow. We're going to share with the community. It's not about us in the room. It's about everybody. Even the orangutans, it's even them. If you're going to do it, us and them. I don't like us and them. I like both and. So anyway, so yeah, this in language. Anne, I hear you, because I picked up on a couple of those things too, and I was like, is that my response? That's my response from the intellect saying this. These are the words I'm used to, and now we're taking those words and we're opening it up to even more words. It's getting
I
bigger.
see some of it is narrowing it.
Yeah,
And-
okay.
Not all of it is opening it up. Some of it is narrowing it. And
Okay.
it may just be,
She's saying
it's
she
a
feels that some of
wordsmithing
it's
thing.
narrowing it.
Yeah, it's a
Oh.
wordsmithing thing.
Mm.
Yeah.
Narrowing it
Other-
with more words.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
it's
you're
kind
putting
of-
more
I
words
can
in
feel-
doesn't
yeah.
necessarily broaden it.
I agree with that in sermon writing too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is a struggle. Yeah.
Just something on love. When I saw this, it just spoke to me with the social action piece of the UUA, which is Side with Love. So I was wondering, is there a connection there? I mean, is that a purposeful connection or?
I would say yes. It wasn't in my understanding, it wasn't like an intentionally charged, like connect that. But I would say it's an organic parallel happening, right? Like we have found in the public square in our justice work, that the Side with Love campaign, which, right, started as standing on the side of love, ableist language, and has shifted to be more broad and inclusive, right? The Side with Love movement is a way to express our values easily, quickly in public. Not as, it's interesting, Anne, not as distinctively Unitarian Universalist, right? That is a multi-faith, non-faith value, but has been effective, So I think having that as the core of our justice work and the core reminding us that, and that is the core of our particular Universalist heritage too, as its focus, its theological distinctive focus, right? Not exclusive. We're the only tradition that believes in love. But a core turning point was the definition of how love manifested in the world, or how it's accessible from the divine, or whatever. So they went together. Paul, you had a hand up here.
So I guess I am trying to understand why we're born about the business of looking into this, making a change. I suspect it might have something to do with the desire to adopt the principle. It just seems more than coincidental that we're talking about adopting the principle and at the same time bringing about this whole change. I was just reading this introduction, and it says, the third paragraph on page 1, it talks about how a Unitarian Universalism that holds us in times of great need and ethical and moral and spiritual crisis. We are in one of those times now. So I guess it's saying that now is a time in which things are cooking, it's a big deal, we need to express our voice. So I guess my question is why? Why are we all of a sudden deciding that this is something that somebody feels we need to do? And I know they talk about not being addressed since 1985 and all of that. I'm just, okay, but why? And I don't know if you have any insight on that or any background on it or what.
I think so. Susan Frederick, if you go to that page, there's some great articles that would go into more nuance. Susan Frederick Gray, our current president, wrote a little article about it too. I would say my quick response is, in the last decade, so while I've been in ministry, there have been some massive cultural shifts in Unitarian Universalism. Its leadership, its foci, its identity in the public square and world, in relationship with larger movements in society, of the movement for Black Lives, and then the pandemic, like these major global happenings. And I think that kind of spurred some leaders, not within the association itself, to promote the possibility of the eighth principle. But that started a conversation that thought, now is a time to delve into this in a deeper way, because of how much has shifted and where we are in the world, and to more accurately reflect who we are as a changing tradition. I would say that that would be kind of the generalized rationale, that we're in a time of global massive change, and in our tradition, massive change over these last several years. And we want our tradition to be a living, continually reforming tradition. And in theory, I think some folks on this commission and others would have said, and we should have been doing this more often than now, since the time that.
Since 1985.
Right, my lifetime, right? So I think that's part of it. I'll take two more comments, questions.
I have just a simple comment. I really love the visual. No matter what words were in there, I would like, I like the center of love and whatever would be in there, but I really think it's very simplistic and flows, and whoever did, it's really lovely. That's all I have to say.
Darren.
I should know my principles better, but the stewardship of the environment, it's not really there. I mean, maybe it's somewhere between justice and interdependence, maybe,
right.
Or I don't know. Is that? Would you say that's because it's a lack of specificity? They're trying to broaden.
Yeah.
You have a lack right away,
Right. Yep. I think the interdependence, I think, was the word they drew from that seventh principle. It's the seventh. I think this was some of the conversation too. Even folks deeply in Unitarian Universalism for many years can't really by heart name the principles. Some can. They're pretty rare. Even among ministers, we're like, we know 1, 4, and 7. Now, what are the other, the others are justicey, but where do they go? Where's the conscience?
Like the Bill of Rights, right?
Yeah, like the Bill of Rights. Like, I get it. I get the sentiment, right? So anyway, sorry. 7.
We all have our
principle.
favorites,
Yes, we have our individual favorites and things we focus on, and free and responsible search, right? I think interdependence was the value they drew from that 7th principle, and they purposely meant to add, we covenant to cherish earth and all beings. So it was a little broader too, broadening it and expanding it, because that's such a beloved principle of many of our people. And I would say it's among the top 3, right? Favorite principles. Inherent worth and dignity, 1. But I think that's a fair, I don't think there's an intention to move away from it, but how it's expressed. Other comment too about, and I know we're over time, we'll end here in a second. I believe I'd have to look back, now I'm questioning myself. I believe in the original principles in 1961, the language about individual dignity was the last principle. And then in the 7th, the redefine, it became first. And I think in some of this, as you would know too, right? Some of these conversations are, how do we appropriately place the individual when we're trying to focus on interconnection and community? And there was almost like, maybe we had something in 61, but we've come at it from a different direction. Like, it shouldn't be belittling of the self, but putting it in context first. Like, sometimes the ethical question is, what if I think of myself as a member of a community first before an individual? And what is that relationship, right?
I had a question when I read that part about communities that came up in chosen faith, but that is what do we mean when we speak of communities? It's not defined.
What do we mean when
Is
we
it
speak of
our
communities?
community?
Yeah.
Is it the greater community? Is it the community of all people? When we talk about the inherent worth and dignity of each person,
Yeah.
it includes all communities. It doesn't matter who you are. It's the same thing as when you get to the last page and it says, we strive to be an association of congregations that truly welcome all persons who share our values. I thought we welcomed everyone. They may not share my values.
Right.
That doesn't mean I don't welcome them.
Good point.
And it's little, I mean, they
Yep.
seem very nitpicky. I don't think they are. Because to me, they kind of get to the heart of who we are.
Right. Yeah.
We need you on that committee, whatever the people are. I mean, your feedback is very good, Anne.
So just quickly.
Yeah.
We could vote as a congregation to accept the 8th principle.
Yep.
And come 2024, the UUA could say, yeah, well, that's all going away and this is new. So what's the purpose of trying to do both?
Yeah, the short answer is the 8th principle was more of a grassroots movement that spread across the association that I think helped inspire this conversation. So as an association, the association is not trying to encourage folks to really do both, but they had one of the leaders who worked on the 8th principle as part of this commission, Paula Cole-Jones, to make sure those values were infused within it. But that's kind of where I'm at too. Like, I want to kind of see how this is shaken out, you know, still engage the conversation within the congregation, but yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, I'm going to pause there because to respect time and children exiting and all of that. But I appreciate so much your presence, the comments, the conversation. What happens next? Opportunities to engage. 2, I just wanted to lift up quick. 1 is with Paula Cole-Jones. She is one of the national leaders. She's on this commission. She's a lifelong UU leader. It's actually right there. Moose Jaw is hosting a forum on Wednesday, February 8th.
18th.
It's
the 18th?
Yeah, it's a Saturday.
Oh yeah, that's a typo. The 18th.
Saturday the 18th. Yeah.
Yeah. Why did it say next Wednesday? I have no idea. Typo, Saturday the 18th. There's the Moose Jaw link. It's in the e-news. It's also on our website, but if you want it, feel free to email me. I'll get you that link. And then General Assembly is in Pittsburgh, but it's also online. We might have some sort of watch party here. Congregations get a certain amount of delegates they can send to vote on things. So if you're planning on engaging with GA, or if you're interested in being a delegate, let me know, and we'll make sure that, especially this and next year, there's some big votes in the UUA. So we'll have some gatherings to kind of prep and think about that, meet with the board or board leaders about that as well. So a couple things coming up. Wednesday, thank you. Appreciate all the comments and conversations.
How did I do?